Hello, welcome to Sophie & Co. Me, Sophie Shevardnadze. Tensions are flaring up in the Asia-Pacific as the rivalry between the U.S. and China grows more fierce, while countries in the region are caught in the crosshairs. Can Australia strike a balance between its two allies and avoid being pulled into a conflict? Well, I'm joined by the former Prime Minister of Australia, the country's ex-Foreign Minister, the Honourable Kevin Rudd is with me today to discuss all of that.
The Asia-Pacific is slowly becoming a field of rivalry between the great powers, the resurgent China staking claims on chunks of the South China Sea, and the US and its allies sending bombers and warships to patrol sea lanes near China's borders. Can the escalation of the powers be controlled? Will the trade interests that tie the region together prevent hostilities worsening, or is a confrontation inevitable?
Honourable Kevin Rudd, former Prime Minister of Australia. It's really great to have you with us on this show today.
Good to be back in Moscow.
Yeah. The weather is great too. So,
That's true.
Mr. Rudd, to the serious matters now. Australia is doubling its military budget. I know that it's going to surge from $24 billion in 1560 to $42 billion in 25-26. So what big threat is it preparing for?
I think generally Australia, given the uncertainties of the Asia-Pacific region, like most other states, has been increasing its defence outlays. In fact, you will find that last year was the first year in history that more money was spent on military hardware in Asia than in Europe. And that is a reflection of where, in fact, we have deteriorating overall national security circumstances and security circumstances across the wider region, which raises the question as to why is this coming about and what we need to do at the level of diplomacy to ensure that we avoid future conflict and war. Our region, as you know, is full of unresolved territorial disputes, and as a consequence, you'll see all governments across the region, regrettably, increasing their defence outlays.
We're going to go through all of that in detail right now, but just your personal take, do you feel like it's justified that Australia is radically increasing its budget right now?
What you see across the region is every country, practically every country, increasing its defence outlays, which I think goes to the question of how do we actually bring about a better set of regional arrangements to ensure long-term peace and security through diplomacy.
But I'm thinking like under a military partnership with the United States, Australia hosts U.S. Marines, military exercises, and Royal Australian Air Force Chief Leo Davies. He said that America's growing military presence in Australia is a natural evolution.
Historically, U.S. Marines would, about 1,000 of them, would spend about 3 months a year in Australia, in Darwin, in the Northern Territory, and they've done that more or less consistently since the end of the Second World War. Now the huge strategic development is now there will be 2,000 of them for 6 months a year. I doubt that that figure alone alters the central strategic balance. I think the broader question is this: how do you go about bringing about a better set of institutional arrangements in East Asia where you do not have the equivalent of the CSCE, the OSCE, or even the Council of Europe to act as a diplomatic buffer against pre-existing security tensions along the fault lines of unresolved border arrangements?
Well, right now, Australia is seen as a partner in Obama's strategic pivot to Asia, which is aimed at containing or isolating China. Do you feel like this American strategy is in Australian interest?
Well, when it comes to what the Americans have at different stages called the rebalance, or at different stages called the pivot, the question is the mathematics of what has actually occurred. Remember, in the past, the United States Navy globally dedicated about 60% of its naval capacity to various theatres around the world, including the Atlantic, including the Mediterranean, including the Middle East, and about 40% to the Pacific. Now, the figure which the United States is aiming for is a 50-50 balance, but against an overall reduction in the level of US naval capabilities and actual fleet and subsurface units. You know what my prediction will be? It will probably end up in net terms being about the same as what it was before. But you're right to point to a fundamental causal factor here, which is the rising tensions which exist between China and the United States, something which I've spent the last 2 years working on in my work at the Harvard Kennedy School and now as president of the Asia Policy Institute of the Asia Society in New York.
But I feel like in between America and China, Australia finds itself in somewhat of a funny situation. Commander of America's 7th Fleet, Admiral Joseph Aucoin, urged Australia to follow America's lead to send warships into the disputed waters around China, a move that would certainly make Beijing at least a little nervous. Do you feel like Australia should directly challenge China?
You know something? We in Australia have acquired a little bit of wisdom, having full recognition of our geographical circumstances in Asia since European settlement began 220 years ago. And that is, we are a long way from everywhere. Our closest neighbour is the largest Muslim country in the world, Indonesia, with a population of 250 million. We in Australia are a population of 24 million. We're in a region which has a population of 3 to 4 billion people. As a consequence, over the last 50, 60, 70 years, we've learnt to walk and chew gum at the same time, have great relations with our economic partners across East Asia, while maintaining an alliance relationship with the United States that effectively we've had continually since 1917, which is quite a long time ago. So when it comes to the tensions which exist between China and the United States, my view in my period in office was what do we do to reduce those tensions over time? That, I think, is the key challenge facing political leaders and diplomats today.
So what do you do to reduce those challenges? Because the military tension is becoming more and more acute. And actually, I was going to ask you, do you feel like this could spiral out of control and actually turn into a real confrontation between the United States and China?
You know something, there's always a danger of that. There is what I would describe as just too much military hardware flying around the place or on the surface of the sea. And it follows almost as a question of probability that when you have X number of military and naval and air assets in a confined space from different countries, sooner or later there could be an accident. And if there's an accident, like an accidental collision, then we know from history that that can give rise to crises, and that in turn can give rise to conflict. So therefore, my strong argument is how do you go about reducing these level of strategic tensions? And so I think what you see in our region are areas where the United States and China in the foreseeable future will not agree, whether it's the East China Sea or the South China Sea or even over elements of Taiwan policy. I just regard that as a reality, but it's been that way for a long time. But there are other areas in where the United States and China and our friends in Russia can in fact work together. And I'd point here to the challenges represented by North Korea and the North Korean nuclear weapons program. Now, I regard that as a common challenge for us all, and if there's a basis upon which to develop some mutual trust between China, the US, and Russia, it's in dealing with common problems like that.
Fair enough, fair enough. But yet this somewhat of a confrontation that's not like openly out there because America and China have really solid economic ties is really in the center of attention right now. Because of the military buildup from all sides and all parties involved. So just recently, China has come under fire for deploying surface-to-air missiles on a contested island in the waters in the South China Sea, a move that Beijing says is defensive. I'm thinking, like, faced with all this American military buildup in the region, it's America surveilling, patrolling the area around China's seas. Do you blame China for being defensive or building up on defense?
Well, when you look at China's military modernization, part of me recognizes that as a natural product of a country moving from being a smaller power to becoming a much greater power. I mean, China's now the second largest economy in the world. It has the capacity to invest in its military. And the military modernization program, which is now underway in the People's Liberation Army, directed by Xi Jinping, the president, is formidable. But it is, against the argument of China's national budgetary capacity, kind of normal. that it develops a much more sophisticated military capability. We'd be pressed to look in history to find a country which suddenly had become a very large global economy and saying, well, thank you, no, I'm just not going to bother developing my defence forces. So I have a fairly practical approach to this. You see, military capabilities are one thing. Dealing with underlying strategic tensions is another. And that's where my analysis goes. North Korea is arguably an area where the two countries can cooperate together with Russia. Frankly, counter-terrorism in Asia is an area where Russia, China and the United States could cooperate a lot more effectively. And also, given that we have such a problem with natural disasters in Asia, where when they hit, because it's so populous, often there's a huge loss of life, the prospect of our three militaries, the ones that I've mentioned, and the others of East Asia cooperating on large-scale counter-disaster exercises and deployments is probably something all the peoples of Asia would welcome, wherever they come from, because when disasters hit, the innocent suffer.
Mr. Rudd, we're going to take a short break right now. When we come back, we'll continue speaking to Kevin Rudd, Australia's former Prime Minister, former Foreign Minister, also a member of Valdai Club. And we'll talk more about what's going on in the Asia-Pacific region, a growing competition between the United States and China, and Australia's role in all of it. Stay with us.
Most people think to stand out in this business, you need to be the first one on top of the story or the person with the loudest voice or the biggest ratings. In truth, to stand out in the news business, you just need to ask the right questions and demand the right answers. Question more.
Ironclad Miginga is roughly half the size of a football pitch. Yet it's home to over 1,000 people, making it the most densely populated island on the planet. Rising out of the waters of Africa's Lake Victoria, Miginga is one of a cluster of 3 islands. And for me, it was a mystery why the people of Miginga were willing to put up with such squalid conditions when there are 2 bigger, completely uninhabited islands just a stone's throw away. And I wanted to get to the bottom of it.
Do we speak your language? Want news, programs and documentaries in Arabic? It's all here on RT. Reporting from the world's hotspots, VIP interviews, intriguing stories. Are you here? Then try RT Arabic. To find out more, visit arabic.rt.com.
And we're back with the Honourable Kevin Rudd, Australia's former Prime Minister, former Foreign Minister, talking about the balance of power in the Asia-Pacific region. Mr. Rudd, and there's also a lot of talk about protecting the freedom of navigation. How do Chinese behavior in the South China Sea actually contradict that? Does it somehow contradict freedom of navigation or somehow threaten that?
We need to see 2 sets of big strategic problems, and they are related, but they are distinct. The first is, in the South China Sea, you see 6 different claimant states with different claims on different parts of the, let's call it the archipelagic region of the South China Sea. Land features and then associated sea features. If you were to put the jigsaw on a map, you and I would both get dizzy within a few seconds because it's so complicated. But frankly, it's been that way for a long time. That's why our Chinese friends have sought, partly successfully, but with much more still to be done, on developing what's called a code of conduct set of negotiations with the countries of Southeast Asia which have these conflicting claims, to be able to work together to manage peacefully the resources within the area, whether they are fishing resources or whether they are minerals on the surface of the sea. That's one set of issues, and it requires very delicate handling. And diplomacy is the only way through. The second is the one you referred to before, which is conflicting perspectives on the question of freedom of navigation. On the question of freedom of navigation, the truth at present is there is no problem. There is no problem. In the future, whether there becomes a problem because of the way in which these territorial claims are resolved and how many of them are, is frankly an open question. But I go back to my continuing point. The only way to deal with this, frankly, given the high seas and coastal sea areas are fundamental for transporting goods around the world, is through peaceful diplomacy and peaceful resolution of long-standing territorial or maritime disputes.
So let's talk a bit about trade and economy. I know that a Chinese company has rented out a port in Darwin, Australia for a 100-year period or something like that. And it's actually right next door to where American and Australian soldiers conduct their drills. And it's made American military really nervous. So I'm just wondering, is Chinese economic presence in Australia somehow threatening Australian and American military security?
Well, based on the example you've just referred to, obviously no. Until about 2 years ago, Australia was the single largest destination of Chinese foreign investment in the world. There are Chinese investments in mining ventures and all sorts of economic operations right across Australia. But because we run a very open foreign investment regime, we're pretty relaxed about that. In fact, we just see it as a natural progress. To begin with, it was British investment, then it was American investment, then it was Japanese investment, now it's Chinese investment, and there's a new wave of Indian investment coming in. That's what happened. So we're pretty relaxed about all of that. And therefore, I go back to your proposition that there is some binary problem between Australian views of the world and the relationship between the United States and China. As I said, we do know how to walk and chew gum, and sometimes we fundamentally disagree with what the United States does. Let me give you an example. My party, the Australian Labor Party, from day one opposed the US invasion of Iraq. The Americans were not happy with that. But when I was elected as Prime Minister, I proceeded to withdraw our forces from Iraq, which were placed there by the previous Conservative government. Now, that didn't lead to happy times between me and President Bush when I was Prime Minister of Australia. But if you want a practical example of the fact that, we Australians from time to time think that our American friends get things wrong, it's a pretty big example.
But at this point, do you ever feel like Australia could become a platform where America and China compete for their dominance?
You know something, if you look at the pattern of US-China relations, there is a big Northeast Asia focus, there is a big East Asia focus. Unless both of them have a big, deep interest in Antarctica at some stage, I really don't see that happening geopolitically. Again, I go back to the question, what is necessary in this part of the world to ensure long-term peace and stability to continue to underpin the phenomenal economic growth we've seen in Asia over the last 40 years, since the end of the Vietnam War. We've not had a major conflict since the end of the Vietnam War. Asia now represents about 45% of global economic activity, and by the time we get to mid-century, it'll be more than half. And so therefore there's a global interest in this region continuing to be a driver of global growth, of trade and investment. What we lack in East Asia is a regional institution which is capable of reducing pre-existing tensions. And that's why, as Prime Minister, I launched the proposal to develop over time what I've called an Asia-Pacific community. And the member states would be Russia, the United States, China, Japan, Korea, the 10 Southeast Asian states, together with India, Australia and New Zealand. At present, they're all members of a loose organisation called the East Asian Summit. And when I was in office, I undertook a lot of diplomacy to ensure that we added both Russia and the United States to its membership so that all the relevant security players would be round one table with an open mandate called the Kuala Lumpur Declaration of 2005, which established the East Asia Summit, to deal with cooperative projects in security and politics and in the economy as well. By developing that institution over time and strengthening its role, I would hope it will act to reduce pre-existing strategic tensions in Northeast Asia. But at present, there is nothing. So as a result, you have these bilateral frictions, people just rubbing up against each other all the time. Far better you have a multilateral institution which can take some of those frictions down a little bit and cause there to evolve the habits and culture of security cooperation and dialogue. Some might say that's just wildly idealistic. I don't think so. I think we get to choose our own futures, and that is why slowly but surely you see regional countries beginning to talk the same language about developing this East Asia Summit into a much more robust regional institution with all players around the table, Russia included.
Talk to me about the TPP. Australia is part of the American-led TransPacific Partnership trade deal, for those who don't know, that brings together Pacific Rim nations, part of the pivot to Asia strategy that's aimed at isolating China. Is this a realistic goal? Can you really isolate second largest economy in the world? Or is it a symbolic move more than anything else?
Well, we in Australia have no interest in isolating China at all. I mean, we've had an extraordinarily strong economic relationship with the Chinese going back 30 years. Our bilateral economic relationship is bigger in every respect than the Russian economic relationship with China. Quantitative terms, it's much bigger.
But you do agree the primary goal of this trade deal is to isolate China, because otherwise China would be part of the deal.
Actually, I don't accept that proposition, but the advantage, the net advantage to Australia of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which again has been negotiated under the current Conservative Australian government, not by me. Its net impact on the Australian economy in terms of additions to economic growth is very marginal, very thin, very small. Why? Because Australia is already a very open economy. It's the economies which are currently much less open, for example, Japan, and for example, Vietnam, good friend of the Russian Federation, which stand to benefit most as a consequence of this arrangement, because you are prizing open the doors of their markets. And we know that there may be initial difficult structural adjustments on the way through, but what happens is that growth then takes off. So the economies which benefit most are literally Vietnam and Japan. But in New York, in the think tank that I lead, called the Asia Policy Institute of the Asia Society, we have already launched an independent policy commission with participation from across the region, including China, on how do we make sure that the Trans-Pacific Partnership does not lock China out in the future. And that is one of the initiatives we have taken, and we brought together Chinese trade officials, I think some from Russia as well, and certainly other countries in the region with that strategic objective. You see, I do share the concern myself that we cannot allow trade policy to divide the region. Trade has been one of the few things which has brought the region together over the last 30, 40 years. You start to create trade blocs, you start to have trade wars, and frankly, I think that's bad for everybody.
So why do you think China wasn't offered to be part of the TPP? Because I've also spoken to Chinese officials, not only trade officials, but government officials, and they said, you know, we never got the proposal. We would be part of it gladly.
Well, it's an American initiative, and the Americans issued invitations. My view has always been, on the public record, when in office, that if this thing ever became a reality, and bear in mind it's still not a reality because the Congress is yet to ratify it, and the United States at present, you have a very trade-hostile United States Congress. But if it does, my position has consistently been, since the time in office, that you cannot create a trading bloc which locks China out. It makes no sense. because China has still this enormous amount of economic growth to contribute to the rest of the world. And frankly, I think it's utterly self-defeating to lock the Chinese out.
Do you feel like it's to Australia's advantage to be part of the TPP? You've mentioned yourself that you had the best economic relations with China, your top trading partners. Just last year, you've signed, I think, the free trade agreement. Is it at Australia's advantage to be part of TPP? Because you've said Japan, Vietnam. What about Australia?
Well, let me go to the question of Japan. Japan is critical. It's the third largest economy in the world, but one which is notoriously protected. Our Japanese friends in a quiet room over a drink or two would admit the same thing. Now, what Prime Minister Abe has done is, I think, deployed Japanese membership of the TransPacific Partnership to prise open his own economy against the domestic pressures towards protectionism which he has. Why does that advantage all of us? Because we, the global economy, stand to benefit for a much more strongly growing Japanese economy, whereas the Japanese economy has been bubbling along at about, 1%, 1.5% for a long period of time. We need to see trend growth in Japan of 3% plus. And in the absence of a stronger traded sector of the Japanese economy forcing within Japan domestically a deregulatory agenda which opens up the market to much more domestic competition in the services sector and retail, then I fear Japan will not be making a contribution to the global economy as much as Prime Minister Abe wants. So if you look at it from that perspective, there is a real virtue in having any multilateral or plurilateral trade agreement with the third largest economy in the world to pull open the doors. But in my judgment, not to the exclusion of China. And I have been consistent on this for many, many years.
Mr. Rutt, thank you very much for this interview. We wish you all the luck, and we thank Moscow's Zloty Plaza for hosting us for this interview. Thank you.
Good to be back in Moscow.